Tasha had been working at the hospital for years. She was a dedicated and skilled nurse, respected by her colleagues for her professionalism and caring nature. But despite her hard work and qualifications, she sometimes felt the weight of the challenges that came with being one of the few black nurses in her department. Even so, she always put on a brave face, knowing that her patients depended on her. On this particular day, everything seemed normal at first. Tasha was assigned to work in the emergency room, where things could get chaotic. The hospital had been busy with patients coming in and out for various treatments. The air was filled with the beeping of machines, the clatter of nurses' shoes on the hard tile floors, and the constant flow of people. But for Tasha, the noise and rush were just part of her routine. She was used to it by now. The doctor on shift was Dr. Adams, a man who had a reputation for being a bit difficult to work with. He was knowledgeable, no doubt, but there was something about his demeanor that always seemed a little too sharp. Today, he was particularly irritable, and it didn't take long for Tasha to notice. As she approached him to discuss the patient chart, Dr. Adams barely glanced at her. He looked over the notes and dismissed her suggestion, saying she was misinterpreting the patient's condition. "I don't think you understand the severity of this," he said coldly, not bothering to hide his condescension. Tasha felt the familiar sting of frustration in her chest, but she didn't show it. She'd been in situations like this before, where her expertise was questioned just because of her race. Tasha had learned to let it go, even though it was never easy. She politely tried to explain her reasoning again, pointing to the patient's symptoms and offering a possible solution. Dr. Adams, however, wasn't having it. "I think I know better," he snapped, his tone laced with irritation. His words echoed throughout the room, loud enough for a few other staff members to notice. The worst part was the patient, Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who had been sitting in the bed, quietly observing the exchange. He had been admitted for a routine checkup, but now he seemed caught in the middle of this unexpected tension. Tasha could see the confusion in his eyes as he looked from Dr. Adams to her, unsure of what was happening. It was the last thing she wanted, to be publicly humiliated, especially in front of a patient. But that's exactly what Dr. Adams did. He raised his voice, dismissing her again in front of Mr. Thompson and making her feel small. "You've misread the situation completely," Dr. Adams said, his words cutting into her confidence. "You should leave this to the experts." Tasha's heart sank as she stood there, her face burning with a mix of embarrassment and anger. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but now, in front of a patient, she felt utterly humiliated. Mr. Thompson, still watching the scene unfold, remained silent. Tasha's mind raced, trying to keep her emotions in check. She was used to this type of treatment, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. As the moments dragged on, she quietly stepped back, doing her best to mask the hurt she felt. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, and though no one spoke up, she knew they had witnessed the injustice. Despite how it made her feel, Tasha took a deep breath and focused on her next task. She had a job to do, and she would not let this moment define her. She would handle it quietly, just like she had so many times before. But inside, the sting of Dr. Adams' words lingered, and she couldn't help but wonder how long she would have to endure these subtle but persistent humiliations. Tasha stood in the hallway, her back pressed against the cool wall, trying to steady her breathing. The exchange with Dr. Adams replayed in her mind, each word sharper than the last. She had never liked confrontation, but today it felt unavoidable. Her hands gripped the clipboard she was holding, knuckles white with tension. Tasha had worked hard to get where she was, and she wasn't the type to back down. Still, a heavy feeling of frustration settled in her chest. She could feel the sting of Dr. Adams' words echoing in her mind. She glanced around the busy hallway. Nurses and doctors rushed by, all with their own tasks to complete. Tasha didn't want to draw attention to herself, so she quickly wiped away the tear that threatened to fall. She had learned to keep her emotions in check over the years. Her job was to take care of the patients, and that's exactly what she was going to do. But as the minutes passed, the humiliation didn't seem to fade. It was as if it had etched itself into her memory. She had dealt with microaggressions before, those subtle comments and actions that were hard to pinpoint but left a lasting impression. The way some people spoke to her as if she weren't quite capable, or the way her ideas were dismissed just because of her race, it all added up. Today, though, it had been different. Dr. Adams hadn't just dismissed her. He had done it publicly, in front of a patient, in front of others who might have been watching. Tasha sighed and made her way back to the nurse's station, where she quickly immersed herself in her duties. She had learned that the best way to move forward was to keep busy, to keep her focus on the patients. But even as she took care of them, there was an underlying discomfort that lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone had witnessed her humiliation. She knew that her colleagues had seen what had happened. Some of them exchanged glances when Dr. Adams had spoken to her in that condescending way, but not one of them stepped in to stop it. As Tasha checked on her next patient, she tried to push the feelings of injustice aside. She had always prided herself on being professional, and she didn't want this moment to ruin her day. She smiled at the elderly woman in the bed, asking her how she was feeling, checking her vitals. The patient smiled back, but Tasha couldn't help feeling distracted. Her mind kept drifting back to Dr. Adams and the way he had made her feel so small. Tasha felt a strange mix of anger and sadness. The anger was directed at Dr. Adams, of course, but also at the system that allowed these things to happen. She had worked so hard to prove herself, yet moments like this made her wonder if her efforts would ever be enough. How many more times would she have to endure this kind of treatment before things changed? It wasn't just about Dr. Adams. It was about every moment, every encounter where her competence was questioned for reasons that had nothing to do with her abilities. As she moved through the shift, Tasha kept her head high, doing her job as she always did. But inside, the hurt was real, and she wasn't sure how long she could keep pushing it down. Just then, the charge nurse walked by and gave Tasha a brief smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that not everyone ignored the unfairness. Maybe, just maybe, someone had noticed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the day went on, Tasha tried her best to focus on the tasks at hand, but the weight of what had happened earlier still lingered. She was still processing everything. How Dr. Adams had dismissed her in front of Mr. Thompson, how he had embarrassed her without a second thought. It was hard not to feel like the hospital, the place where she had worked so hard to build her career, was a place where she was always going to be looked down on. The hours dragged by, but the hospital remained busy, as usual. Tasha did what she could to stay distracted, helping her patients and checking in on her fellow nurses. Every so often, she glanced over at Dr. Adams, but he seemed completely unbothered by the incident. It was as if nothing had happened at all. Tasha couldn't understand how he could go about his day like that, without any regret or acknowledgement of what he had done. Mr. Thompson, the elderly patient, had been discharged a few hours earlier. His room had been cleaned, and the staff moved on to the next round of patients. But something about Mr. Thompson stuck with Tasha. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him than just an ordinary patient. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, but she had noticed the way he had watched her and Dr. Adams during the exchange. His gaze had been steady, thoughtful. There was something in the way he had looked at her that made her feel like he wasn't just an observer. He was someone who had been paying attention. Later that afternoon, Tasha found herself at the nurse's station, taking a moment to rest before her next round. As she flipped through some paperwork, she overheard a conversation between two of the doctors in the hallway. The topic was about Mr. Thompson, and Tasha couldn't help but listen in. One of the doctors mentioned how Mr. Thompson wasn't just any patient. He was actually Charles Thompson, the founder of a major medical foundation. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but it wasn't until they mentioned the foundation's work in supporting hospitals and promoting diversity in healthcare that Tasha started to understand. Mr. Thompson wasn't just any elderly man. He was a powerful figure in the medical world. Tasha's mind began to race as the pieces fell into place. The way Mr. Thompson had watched the interaction between her and Dr. Adams made sense now. He hadn't just been an innocent bystander. He had been observing everything, likely more aware of the situation than Tasha had initially realized. It hit her then. The man she had served had been a key supporter of the very institution she worked for. Mr. Thompson's foundation had donated millions to the hospital over the years, and he was a strong advocate for diversity in healthcare, something Tasha had always been passionate about. It made sense now why he hadn't reacted when Dr. Adams had belittled her. He hadn't been unaware of what had happened. He had been quietly assessing it. As she stood there, her thoughts racing, Tasha realized that this incident wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger, a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. And in some strange way, Mr. Thompson's presence in the hospital felt like a turning point. Maybe he could help. Maybe this was the chance for real change. Tasha took a deep breath, trying to calm her thoughts. She had always believed in doing her part to make things better, no matter how difficult it seemed. And now, perhaps she wasn't alone in that fight. She hadn't realized it before, but Mr. Thompson might be the key to making sure that what had happened to her wouldn't happen again. Not just to her, but to anyone else who had faced similar injustices. She felt a spark of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, Tasha couldn't shake the events from the day before. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Mr. Thompson. And now, after learning more about his true identity, she felt like the situation had shifted in ways she hadn't fully realized at the time. She had always done her best to focus on her patients and her work, but now the incident with Dr. Adams seemed larger than just one bad moment. It was something bigger, something she couldn't ignore. As the day wore on, she couldn't help but notice the quiet shift in the hospital. There was a subtle buzz in the air, a murmur of people talking about Mr. Thompson and his connection to the hospital. Tasha heard bits and pieces of conversations as she moved through the halls, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard the day before. Mr. Thompson wasn't just a regular patient. He was a man who had the power to change things. Later that afternoon, while Tasha was assisting a patient in one of the exam rooms, she was told that Mr. Thompson had requested to speak with her. Her heart skipped a beat at the unexpected request. She had no idea what he might want, but she couldn't help but feel a little nervous. What if he had noticed something in her behavior during the incident? What if he had decided to speak up about what had happened between her and Dr. Adams? When she walked into his room, Mr. Thompson was sitting comfortably in his bed, a warm smile on his face. He looked calm, collected, but there was a certain intensity in his eyes that made Tasha pause for a moment. He greeted her politely, and for a brief second, she felt almost like she was back in the patient's shoes, unsure of what this interaction would bring. "Thank you for taking the time to speak with me, Nurse Tasha," Mr. Thompson said, his voice smooth and gentle. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened yesterday." His words were direct, but his tone wasn't accusatory. Instead, he seemed calm and understanding, as though he truly wanted to hear her side of the story. Tasha felt a wave of relief wash over her, and she took a seat beside him. It was clear that Mr. Thompson wasn't here to add to the pressure she was already feeling. He wasn't angry or upset. Instead, there was a quiet empathy in his voice. She wasn't sure how to respond, but she nodded as he continued. "I saw what happened with Dr. Adams," he said slowly, "and I want to tell you that what he did wasn't right. I've worked in healthcare for a long time, and I've seen a lot of things, but I could tell by the way you handled the situation that you are a professional. You deserve respect." Tasha was taken aback. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, especially not someone as influential as Mr. Thompson. His words were kind, and they carried a weight that made her feel understood in a way that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had always tried to keep her head down, to endure the little indignities, but hearing him acknowledge the hurt that she had felt made a part of her feel seen. "I've spent a lot of time working on improving diversity in healthcare," Mr. Thompson went on, "and I've seen how things can go wrong when people aren't given the respect they deserve. Yesterday, I saw something that I won't let slide. I may not be able to change everything overnight, but I want to make sure you're not overlooked." Tasha sat quietly, absorbing his words. It was strange. After all the time she had been ignored, dismissed, or undervalued, hearing someone speak with such genuine understanding was almost overwhelming. She realized in that moment that Mr. Thompson didn't just see her as a nurse. He saw her as a person who deserved dignity and respect. As their conversation continued, Tasha started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something more. Perhaps with Mr. Thompson's help, she wouldn't have to keep silent or accept mistreatment anymore. Maybe things could change. A few days later, Tasha received a message asking her to meet with Mr. Thompson in a private room. Her curiosity grew as she wondered what he might want to discuss now. Her mind wandered back to their last conversation, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was serious about making a change. She was nervous, but also hopeful. Could this really be the turning point she had been waiting for? When Tasha entered the room, she found Mr. Thompson sitting at a table with a few other people, all of them with serious expressions. She recognized some of them as members of the hospital's administration. Mr. Thompson greeted her with a smile, which put her at ease, but she could tell this meeting wasn't just a casual check-in. He had something important on his mind. "Please take a seat," Mr. Thompson said. Tasha sat down, trying to remain calm, but her heart was racing. She had no idea what to expect. After a few moments of small talk, Mr. Thompson got to the point. "I've been speaking with the hospital administration about the incident that occurred between you and Dr. Adams," he began. Tasha's stomach tightened as she listened, but she stayed quiet, waiting for him to continue. "It's clear to me that what happened wasn't just an isolated event. It's part of a larger issue, one that affects not just you, but many others working here." Tasha nodded slowly, knowing all too well that the problem wasn't just with one doctor. It was part of a bigger pattern, one that had been ignored for far too long. "I agree," she said softly. "It's not just about me. It's about the way people like me are treated here. It happens every day, in small ways, but it adds up." Mr. Thompson looked at her with understanding. "That's exactly why I've decided to take action," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I've been working with the hospital's board to implement changes. It's not going to be easy, and it will take time, but we need to make sure that everyone, no matter their race or background, gets the respect they deserve." Tasha felt a surge of gratitude. She had always known that something needed to change, but she never imagined she would be part of that change. The idea of the hospital taking responsibility for its shortcomings felt like a dream. But with Mr. Thompson's support, it might be possible. Mr. Thompson continued, explaining that the hospital had agreed to put in place new training programs aimed at addressing unconscious biases, improving communication, and fostering a more inclusive environment. He also mentioned that there would be a review of the hospital's policies to ensure that all staff members were treated fairly, with respect and dignity. "Your experience, Tasha, wasn't the first," Mr. Thompson said. "And unfortunately, it won't be the last unless we do something about it. But I want you to know that you've helped make this possible. Your bravery in facing this situation head-on has set the stage for change." Tasha sat there in awe. She had always dreamed of making a difference, but she never thought it would happen so directly. Her voice had been heard, and now it seemed like real progress was on the way. She felt a sense of pride in herself for not letting the moment pass without speaking up. Mr. Thompson finished the meeting by assuring Tasha that she would be involved in the process. "You're going to be part of the task force that helps implement these changes," he said. "Your insights and experiences are invaluable. You've been on the front lines, and you know what needs to change." Tasha's heart swelled with a mix of surprise and gratitude. She had never expected something like this. She thought that speaking up would just make her a target, but now it was clear that her courage had made a lasting impact. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a catalyst for change, and that thought filled her with a new sense of purpose. As she left the meeting, Tasha felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The hospital wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. Change was on the horizon, and it had started with her. The days that followed felt like a blur to Tasha. The atmosphere in the hospital had started to shift, and it was impossible not to notice. There was a new energy in the air, a quiet but noticeable change. Some of her colleagues, who had once kept their heads down and avoided speaking up, now seemed more willing to engage in conversations about fairness and respect. It was as though a door had been opened, and they were cautiously stepping through it. The changes Mr. Thompson had promised were starting to take shape, and Tasha couldn't help but feel proud to be a part of it. The first step was the sensitivity and diversity training that had been rolled out for all staff members. While some of her colleagues had grumbled about it, Tasha felt hopeful. She had participated in similar workshops before, but this one felt different. The sessions were longer, more interactive, and focused not just on theory, but also on real-world examples. There were discussions about unconscious biases, ways to improve communication, and methods to create a more inclusive environment for both patients and staff. As the sessions went on, Tasha could see how the training was beginning to resonate with some of her colleagues. A few of them, who had always been quiet and reserved, started to ask thoughtful questions, trying to understand the impact of their actions. Others, who had once seemed indifferent to the issues, began to look at their own behavior more critically. It wasn't perfect, and not everyone embraced the change immediately, but there was progress. Small steps, but meaningful ones. One afternoon, after one of the training sessions, Tasha found herself in the break room, chatting with a nurse she had worked with for years, Clara. Clara had been one of those people who had seemed indifferent to the changes in the past, but lately she had started to speak up more. "I never realized how much I was just ignoring things," Clara said, her voice tinged with regret. "I always thought I was being neutral, but I see now that I wasn't. I was part of the problem. It feels like I've been blind to it all this time." Tasha nodded, understanding exactly what Clara meant. "It's a lot to process, but I think we're getting there," she said. "Change is hard, but it's worth it. And we're making progress." Clara smiled faintly. "You've definitely been a part of making that happen. I've seen how you handled everything with Dr. Adams, and it made me think twice about how I act." Tasha felt a wave of warmth at Clara's words. She wasn't sure if she'd ever thought of herself as an agent of change, but hearing her colleagues acknowledge the impact of her actions made her realize that even small steps could create ripples. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson had been involved in several meetings with the hospital's board, pushing for more concrete changes. He was a quiet force behind the scenes, advocating for policies that would help create a more welcoming and equitable environment for everyone. He had already promised Tasha that her voice would be heard in these discussions, and she had been included in several of the planning sessions. At one of those meetings, Mr. Thompson spoke about the importance of not just training staff, but also creating a system of accountability. "It's one thing to educate people," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "But if there are no consequences for harmful behavior, then it's all just words. We need to ensure that the changes we're implementing are backed by action." Tasha had never seen him so passionate, and his words resonated deeply with her. He was right. Education was only part of the solution. Real change had to come from a place of accountability and consistency. As weeks passed, Tasha started to see more and more signs of change. It wasn't always immediate, and there were moments when the old habits crept back in, but she could see that people were beginning to think differently. They were starting to listen more, not just to her, but to each other. One day, as Tasha was walking through the hospital, she saw Dr. Adams in the hallway. For a moment, her heart raced as she thought back to the day he had humiliated her. But as she approached, something was different. Dr. Adams made eye contact with her and gave her a small, genuine nod of acknowledgement. Tasha paused, surprised by the gesture. She had never expected him to be the one to change. But there it was, a silent recognition of the work they were all doing. It wasn't a grand apology, But it was enough. It was a sign that things were slowly shifting, and that maybe, just maybe, people were starting to recognize the value of respect and empathy. The journey wasn't over. There were still challenges to face and more work to be done, but Tasha felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just enduring anymore. She was part of a larger movement, one that was making real changes, both in the hospital and in the... As the weeks went by, Tasha noticed a slow but steady change within the hospital. The air felt lighter, and there was a sense of optimism that hadn't been there before. Staff members were more willing to listen to each other, and there was a genuine effort to create a more supportive, respectful environment. The training had made a difference, but it was the collective effort of everyone involved that started to show real results. There was still a long way to go, but Tasha couldn't help but feel encouraged by the progress they were making. Mr. Thompson continued to be a driving force behind these changes. His involvement had brought attention to the issues of fairness and equality within the hospital, and he wasn't about to let things slip back into old habits. He held regular meetings with the hospital's leadership to make sure that the new policies were being implemented effectively. He also took the time to speak with staff members, especially those who had been on the front lines like Tasha, to get their feedback on how the changes were affecting day-to-day operations. Tasha found herself involved in these meetings more often, sharing her thoughts on what was working and what still needed improvement. She felt valued in a way she hadn't in years, as if her voice really mattered. It wasn't just about her own experiences anymore. It was about the collective effort to make the hospital a place where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel safe and respected. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting with the hospital board, Mr. Thompson pulled Tasha aside. She had just shared some ideas for further improving communication between different departments, and he was eager to hear her thoughts. "You've been instrumental in all of this, Tasha," he said, his tone genuine. "Your perspective has been invaluable, and I want to make sure we keep moving forward with these changes. You're not just a part of this process, you're leading it." Tasha felt a rush of warmth at his words. It wasn't often that she was praised in such a direct and meaningful way. She had always believed that change was possible, but hearing Mr. Thompson acknowledge her role in it made her realize just how much she had grown over the past few weeks. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was part of something much bigger, something that could impact the lives of many people in the future. As the hospital began to implement more policies aimed at promoting diversity and inclusivity, Tasha saw firsthand how much of a difference it made. The interactions between staff members were shifting. Conversations were becoming more open, and people were more willing to talk about the challenges they faced. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments where old habits crept in, but the overall atmosphere felt different. It felt like people were finally starting to understand that creating an inclusive workplace wasn't just about policy. It was about creating a culture where everyone felt seen and heard. One of the most striking changes was the way the hospital leadership began to approach feedback. Tasha had always felt that her voice wasn't valued, but now she could see that things were changing. During a recent meeting, the hospital administrator had asked for feedback from the staff, not just in terms of improving procedures, but also in how the leadership could better support them. Tasha spoke up, sharing her thoughts on how to create a more welcoming environment for everyone, especially those who had been overlooked in the past. She was nervous, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. It felt like her ideas were finally being taken seriously. As Tasha walked through the hospital corridors that day, she couldn't help but smile. There was still a lot of work to be done, and she knew that the path forward wouldn't always be smooth, but the progress they had made in such a short amount of time was undeniable. The hospital was changing, and Tasha was at the center of it. She wasn't just a passive participant. She was a leader in this movement for change. Her relationship with her colleagues had shifted too. People were starting to see her in a new light, not just as a nurse, but as someone who could make a difference. Clara, who had once seemed indifferent, had become a close ally. They often shared ideas for improving patient care and communication within the hospital. Even Dr. Adams, who had been one of the hardest people to reach, had started to show small signs of change. Tasha had noticed him taking more time to listen to her suggestions during rounds, and while it wasn't always easy, she appreciated the effort. For the first time in a long while, Tasha felt like she was part of a community that was working toward a common goal. It wasn't just about getting through the day or dealing with the challenges of the job. It was about creating a space where everyone could thrive. As Tasha continued her work at the hospital, the changes around her became even more noticeable. The atmosphere, which had once felt heavy and tense, was now filled with a sense of hope and possibility. She had never imagined that something as small as standing up for herself could lead to such a shift in the way things operated. But now, with each passing day, it seemed as though the entire hospital was learning to work together in a new way, more focused on understanding and respect. Tasha's role had changed too. She wasn't just another nurse anymore. She had become a voice for those who hadn't been heard, a person who could speak up and make a difference. There were moments when she still felt overwhelmed, when the pressure of it all threatened to creep back in, but those moments were fewer now. The support of her colleagues and Mr. Thompson kept her grounded and reminded her why she had taken the first step to speak out in the first place. The work wasn't easy, and there were still challenges to face, but Tasha had learned how to navigate them with more confidence. She knew that there would always be people who would resist change or push back against the progress being made. But now, she felt ready for those challenges. She had the backing of the hospital leadership, and more importantly, she had the trust and respect of her colleagues, many of whom had once been silent, but were now speaking up alongside her. In one of the recent staff meetings, Mr. Thompson had once again praised Tasha for her leadership and determination. "It's people like you, Tasha, who make a real difference," he had said in front of the entire room. "Your courage to speak out and bring attention to these issues is exactly what we need to keep moving forward. You've shown us all what it means to be a part of a community that works together." Those words had meant more to her than anything else in the past few weeks. She had started this journey feeling small and uncertain, unsure if her voice could make a real impact. But now, as she stood in front of the same people who had once dismissed her, she felt proud of what she had accomplished, not just for herself, but for everyone who had faced similar struggles. As she moved through her daily tasks, Tasha noticed something different. Patients were more likely to engage with her, and there was a growing sense of trust in the air. People were starting to open up, not just to her but to each other. It felt like the walls that had once divided them, whether because of race, background, or position, were slowly coming down. The team was becoming stronger, more unified, and more compassionate. Even Dr. Adams, who had once been the source of so much frustration for Tasha, seemed to be making an effort to change. There were still moments when his old habits crept in, but Tasha had noticed him taking the time to listen more, to ask questions, and even apologize when he made mistakes. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Tasha had come to realize that change didn't always happen in big, dramatic moments. Sometimes it happened quietly, over time, in small, everyday actions. The hospital was not perfect, and Tasha knew that there was still a lot of work to be done. There were still policies to refine, behaviors to address, and attitudes to shift. But for the first time in a long time, she believed that real change was possible. She had seen it in the way her colleagues interacted with one another, in the way they had begun to challenge the status quo, and in the way they were building a culture where respect and kindness mattered more than ever. Tasha had come a long way since that painful moment with Dr. Adams. The feelings of humiliation and frustration that had once consumed her were now replaced with a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had learned that standing up for herself, and for others, could lead to more than just personal growth. It could spark a movement, one that spread through the entire hospital, affecting everyone who worked there. As she looked ahead, Tasha felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the path wasn't always going to be smooth, but she also knew that she was no longer alone in the fight for equality and respect. The hospital had become a place where her voice mattered, where her ideas were taken seriously, and where she could continue to make a real difference. And that, in the end, was all she had ever wanted, to know that her efforts had contributed to a change that would help not just herself, but everyone who came after her. The future was uncertain, but Tasha was ready for whatever came next.